Hello, my whoop friends and RC pilots. In this video, I would like to introduce you to an unusual aircraft, a mix between an airplane and a helicopter, a so-called gyrocopter or auto-gyro. In this case, it is the Durafly Auto-G2V2 gyrocopter from Hobbyking with auto start function. I always wanted to fly an auto-gyro, and when Hobbyking asked me for a review, I immediately agreed. I think every RC pilot and aviation fan should have flown a gyrocopter at least once in their model flying career. The Durafly Auto-G2V2 gyrocopter from Hobbyking has been on my wish list for a long time, and I am happy that thanks to Hobbyking, I was able to gain this experience and share my flight experience with you so that you are perfectly prepared if you decide to get a Durafly Auto-G2V2 gyrocopter yourself. Of course, I also flew the gyrocopter with FPV using the Artlynk HD video system from Betafpv. The Durafly Auto-G2V2 gyrocopter is suitable for all pilots who already have some experience. RC-gyrocopters are not difficult to fly, but also not quite as easy as an RC airplane. To fly an RC-Autogyro, you need to be comfortable flying with the rudder. And ideally, flying in a Harrier should not be a problem for you either. If one or even both of these requirements are met, then you will have a lot of fun with the Durafly Auto-G2V2 gyrocopter from Hobbyking. I definitely had a lot of fun with it and tested the Auto-G2V2 thoroughly so that I can offer you the best possible in-depth review, which includes all the information you need for assembling and flying this RC gyrocopter. Use the chapters to navigate through the video. I tried to structure the video in a way that allows you to quickly find the information you need. If you would like to buy a Durafly Auto-G2V2 gyrocopter from Hobbyking or anything else from Hobbyking through this video, then I, or rather Hobbyking, can offer you a 5% discount if you purchase the product through the affiliate link in the video description of this video and enter the code BFFPV at checkout. And if you really appreciate the review style of this video and would like to see more reviews like this in the future, you can support me financially on Ko-Fi.com. You can also find the link in the video description of this video. Now I wish you a lot of fun with the rest of the video. Use the chapters. Unboxing. The unboxing is largely self-explanatory. Everything you would expect from an almost ready-to-fly model is included. That means everything is included except the transmitter, the receiver, and the LiPo battery and LiPo charger. For the receiver, you should choose a very small 5 to 6 channel receiver with long antennas. The battery size is limited by the tight battery compartment. I flew it with a 1350 mAh E-flite LiPo battery with a height of 0.9 inch or 24 millimeters, a length of 2.7 inch or 68 millimeters, and a width of 1.4 inch or 34 millimeters, and a weight of around 114 grams. I don't think the battery should be much bigger. A few millimeters might still fit, but the battery compartment is limited. I will show you the assembly of the Hobbyking Gyro G2V2 gyrocopter in another chapter of this video. Use the chapters to navigate through the video. Assembly. The assembly of the Hobbyking RC-G2V2 gyrocopter is mostly self-explanatory and should not cause any major problems for an experienced RC pilot. If you still need instructions, you can find a detailed step-by-step guide with pictures on the Hobbyking website, and the link to it in the video description of this video or in my first comment. In addition, I have included the full manual here in the video in the chapter Full Manual. Even though the assembly is relatively simple, I would still like to point out a few things. The first point is installing the landing gear into the fuselage of the Autogyro. It was not very easy to install the landing gear. First, you have to disconnect the motor wires from the ESC and pull the motor wires forward out of the cooling air opening of the fuselage. Then you have to install the landing gear, which is unfortunately quite tight, but it works with water pump pliers. At the end, you can reconnect the motor connectors. It is best to take a photo before disconnecting the connectors so you know which ones were connected. If two motor connectors are swapped, that is not a big problem. The only thing that can happen is that the motor rotates in the wrong direction. If that happens, you need to disconnect two connectors again and reconnect them swapped. Disconnecting the connectors is not easy, but with the right technique, it works. I inserted my index finger from the front through the cooling air opening and used my fingertip to push one motor connector upward into the foam of the fuselage. With the other hand, I grabbed the other part of the motor connector through the battery hatch and pulled the connectors apart. That's how I disconnected one motor connector after the other. I also connected the motor connectors using this technique. The second point is installing and connecting a 5 to 6 channel receiver of your choice. Connecting the servo wires to the receiver is largely self-explanatory, but there is a single yellow wire coming from the ESC where I do not know if it has any function. I did not use it. As far as I know, it has no function in this model. Unfortunately, there is not much space for the receiver inside the fuselage of the gyrocopter, and there is not much you can do about it. You can see in this video how I roughly installed the receiver. I routed the long antenna through the servo maintenance hatch on the fuselage. The third point is mounting the tail landing gear. If you completely remove the screws on the plastic tube clamps of the horizontal stabilizer, you can also slide the horizontal stabilizer onto the tube afterward, even if the tail landing gear is already inside the carbon tube. However, I installed the horizontal stabilizer first, and then loosened the rear plastic tube clamp again to insert the plastic pin of the tail landing gear into the carbon tube. I did not glue the tail landing gear. I think it holds well enough in the carbon tube when the plastic tube clamp is tightened. This way I can still adjust it later, but everyone has to decide that for themselves. The alignment of the horizontal stabilizer is done by eye. The underside of the fuselage is unfortunately not straight, and is therefore not suitable as a reference surface for alignment. For the split linkage of the rudder and the tail landing gear, it is important that you use the direct linkage for the rudder and the additional linkage attached to the main linkage for the tail landing gear. This ensures that you can always control with the rudder even if the additional linkage comes loose. Mounting the propeller is self-explanatory, and mounting the rotor as well. Both are secured with a nut or an end cap with an integrated nut on the corresponding shaft. Before gluing the vertical stabilizer, it is important that you remove the paint at the bonding area. The paint is somewhat sensitive and comes off when tape is applied and removed. For example, in my case, when I tried to keep the many cables out of the way with tape while installing the landing gear. I set the control throws as specified in the manual. That means I attached the clevises to the outermost hole on the control horns. This gave me the large control throws as described in the manual. I did not use any expo on the transmitter. I set the control surface centers roughly with the clevises, and then used a bit of trim to visually center the control surfaces. That's how I did the maiden flight. The battery size is limited by the tight battery compartment. I flew it with a 1350 mAh E-flite LiPo battery with a height of 0.9 inch or 24 millimeters, a length of 2.7 inch or 68 millimeters, and a width of 1.4 inch or 34 millimeters, and a weight of around 114 grams. I don't think the battery should be much bigger. A few millimeters might still fit, but the battery compartment is limited. I'm installing and connecting a 5 to 6 channel receiver of your choice. For the receiver, you should choose a very small 5 to 6 channel receiver with long antennas. Connecting the servo wires to the receiver is largely self-explanatory, but there is a single yellow wire coming from the ESC where I do not know if it has any function. I did not use it. As far as I know, it has no function in this model. Unfortunately, there is not much space for the receiver inside the fuselage of the gyrocopter, and there is not much you can do about it. You can see in this video how I roughly installed the receiver. I routed the long antenna through the servo maintenance hatch on the fuselage. Straightening the propeller. On my gyrocopter, the propeller was slightly uneven, so I heated it slightly with a hairdryer and straightened it. That is probably not absolutely necessary, but I like my aircraft to have as little vibration as possible. The same applies to the rotor, which I balanced. More on that in the corresponding chapter of this video. Balancing the rotor blades. Balancing the rotor blades, or rather the main rotor, may not be absolutely necessary, but is still highly recommended. In my case, one rotor blade was 0.5 grams lighter than the other two rotor blades. Ideally, all rotor blades should have the same weight and the same center of gravity. That is the goal of the balancing process. Step 1 is identifying the heaviest rotor blade, the second heaviest rotor blade, and the lightest rotor blade using a precise scale. Then, the rotor blades are marked with a waterproof pen, so you always know which is which. Step 2 is finding the center of gravity of the heaviest rotor blade. For this, I mounted a knife with tape on a table. On it, I could balance the rotor blade and determine the blade's center of gravity. Once the center of gravity is known, it is marked on the heaviest rotor blade and then transferred to all other rotor blades. The heaviest rotor blade is the master blade, and the other rotor blades are the slaves. The master rotor blade remains unchanged, and in the next steps, we try to match the other rotor blades to this master blade. Step 3 is adjusting the slave rotor blades to the master rotor blade by applying tape to the leading edge of the rotor blade. At the same time, you also have to make sure that the center of gravity is correct in the end. That means in the end, both the weight and the center of gravity must match. In my case, I had to apply one strip of tape along the entire leading edge of one rotor blade, and in addition, another piece of tape to fine-tune the center of gravity. When all rotor blades are properly balanced, they all have the same weight and the same center of gravity. I did the balancing very precisely. It is not absolutely necessary to be that precise, but ideally it would be. Center of gravity and battery size. The battery size is limited by the tight battery compartment. I flew it with a 1350 mAh E-flite LiPo battery with a height of 0.9 inch or 24 millimeters, a length of 2.7 inch or 68 millimeters, and a width of 1.4 inch or 34 millimeters, and a weight of around 114 grams. I don't think the battery should be much bigger. A few millimeters might still fit, but the battery compartment is limited. The center of gravity specified in the quick start guide for this RC-Autogyro can be achieved quite accurately with a LiPo battery weighing 114 grams. If the LiPo battery is heavier, you may need to add counterweight at the tail of the model to properly balance the RC-Gyrocopter again. And if the battery is significantly lighter, you may need to add counterweight in the nose of the aircraft. Pre-rotation warning. On my model, the safety circuit of the pre-rotation did not work. That means if the pre-rotation switch on my transmitter is accidentally in the on position when I connect the flight battery to the Auto-G2V2, the main rotor immediately starts spinning. Therefore, I always have to make sure that the pre-rotation switch on my transmitter is in the off position before connecting the flight battery to the aircraft. How to fly the Auto-G2V2 gyrocopter. RC gyrocopters are not difficult to fly, but also not quite as easy as an RC airplane. To fly an RC-Autogyro, you need to be comfortable flying with the rudder. You should also be able to keep the RC gyrocopter straight over the entire takeoff run using the rudder. Ideally, flying in a Harrier should not be a problem for you either. If these requirements are met, you will have a lot of fun with the Durafly Auto-G2V2 gyrocopter from Hobbyking. The takeoff is relatively easy, as long as you can keep the gyrocopter straight on the runway until it lifts off. In principle, an auto-gyro takes off just like an RC airplane, apart from the pre-rotation of the main rotor. It is important that you let the main rotor reach full speed before starting the takeoff. In general, you can also take off this autogyro without pre-rotation. But the takeoff distance will be much longer, and you must pay close attention during the takeoff run that the main rotor has reached full speed and that the correct takeoff speed is achieved before lifting off. The same also applies to touch and goes if you have rolled too long on the ground and the rotor has lost RPM again. Always make sure full rotor speed is reached before takeoff. In flight, the Auto-G2V2 wants to be flown with a lot of rudder and little aileron. Control inputs must be deliberate and smooth. The Auto-G2V2 does not like fast aileron inputs, and it also does not like too much bank angle. In general, the Auto-G2V2 is very stable in flight, but in some wind it still needs to be guided a bit more than an RC airplane, in my experience, similar to a helicopter. However, that might also have felt that way to me because of the somewhat sluggish roll response, which becomes even slower in slow flight. The most difficult part of flying the Auto-G2V2 is orientation. For me as a very experienced pilot, it was not a problem, but I analyzed a few YouTube videos from other pilots, and in my opinion, in 99% of the crashes, the cause was loss of orientation and the resulting incorrect control inputs. Therefore, make sure to only fly the Auto-G2V2 in good lighting conditions. In my experience, the Auto-G2V2 does not suffer from a stall of the main rotor. However, at very low speeds, there is a kind of stall at the rudder, which then cannot control anymore because it is not getting enough airflow. In that situation, the Auto-G2V2 tends to yaw slightly to the left. With headwind, it may not be much, but with tailwind, it can be up to a 45-degree turn. Recovery from this state is relatively simple and is done by adding more throttle. The flight direction is then dictated by the gyrocopter and can only be corrected again once sufficient airspeed has been regained. On a large flying field, with enough altitude, and if the pilot has good orientation, it is no problem to recover the Auto-G2V2 from flying too slowly. It is important that the pilot remains calm during recovery, and only starts steering again once the flight attitude and direction of the autogyro are fully understood again. When flying a gyrocopter, you need to know that larger altitude changes, especially reducing altitude, are mainly done with throttle, similar to flying an RC paraglider, which I have also reviewed on this YouTube channel. What you definitely must not do when flying the Auto-G2V2 is push the elevator too much and for too long. Negative G-forces slow down the main rotor and can lead to a crash. Make sure the aircraft is always under positive G-forces. In other words, the fuselage should always be hanging from the main rotor, similar to paragliding, where positive G-forces are always required to keep the wing open and pressurized. Also, make sure you never go completely to zero throttle, especially during U-turns and other maneuvers where you might be used to cutting throttle in an RC airplane. I do not recommend aerobatics with the Auto-G2V2. In theory, it might be possible, but it is a discipline of its own, and the risk of crashing is significantly higher. My only crash with the Auto-G2V2 during the test flights was, based on my analysis, caused by three things, probably too much roll angle. At the same moment, a gust of wind that hit the main rotor from below due to the excessive roll angle and reduced rotor RPM, too little altitude for a full recovery, and insufficient power due to old LiPo batteries. However, since I was still able to level the gyrocopter before touchdown in a wheat field, there was no damage to the aircraft. In my opinion, the Auto-G2V2 is a good flying aircraft that can be flown very slowly and, after a short adjustment period of a few flights, can also be flown in wind and even handles tailwind without problems. However, I would still recommend better flying conditions with calm or light wind and low turbulence, especially considering that spare parts for the Auto-G2V2 are currently, and likely in the future, not available. I did not test auto rotations all the way to the ground with zero throttle because I wanted to pass the aircraft onto another RC pilot in flyable condition. In theory, it should be possible. Maybe I will test that in the future and make a video about it. For the rest of the flight footage, I will read you the instructions for flying the Auto-G2V2 gyrocopter from the original Durafly manual. First, just a little insight into the differences between flying an autogyro and a conventional fixed-wing airplane. Autogyros are often regarded as unstable by fixed-wing airplane pilots. This is certainly true if you try to fly an autogyro using fixed-wing principles. Flown properly, an autogyro is actually safer and easier than flying a fixed-wing airplane, as it is unable to stall. A fixed wing will stall if it is flown too slowly for the wing to produce lift. Since the rotor of an autogyro is always spinning, it simply cannot stall. If the forward airspeed becomes 0, the autogyro will slowly drift to the ground rotors still spinning. Okay, a vertical landing in this manner will not be a smooth affair, but it should not damage the model. The one weakness they do have is that they can lose rotor control authority if you subject the rotor to negative G forces, such as pushing the elevator stick forward, like going over a humpback bridge. Remember that a flying autogyro hangs from the rotor much like an object hanging on a piece of string. As long as the autogyro is hanging from the rotor, stability is maintained. The instant 0 or negative G is introduced, the rotor speed begins to decay and stability is lost. If this situation occurs whilst flying, then ease back on the elevator. This increases the angle of attack, causing the airflow to pass back up through the rotors, allowing them to spin back up to speed and resume stability. This is why in normal flight, the rotors are angled backwards. This causes the airflow to pass up through the rotors from underneath to keep them spinning at speed. Now you understand a little more about the differences in flying your Auto-G2V2. You should be ready for your first flights. Set your rates to high and start with a bit of taxiing around to get used to the ground handling. Make sure you hold in full up elevator while taxiing. With the big bush-style wheels and wider, sturdier landing gear, you will notice that taxiing around is much better with the Auto-G2V2 than earlier versions of this model. Once lined up for takeoff into wind, hold a little bit of right roll, ailerons, as it will try to roll a little to the left as you accelerate to lift off. Also, hold in some up elevator. Flick the auto start switch and wait for the rotors to spin up to full speed. Once at full speed, gently open the throttle and keep the model straight using rudder. Ease off the elevator as the speed increases, and as the tail lifts up, your Auto-G2V2 should lift smoothly into the air and steadily climb out. You will most probably not be anywhere near full throttle to achieve a nice smooth climb out. Switch the auto start off at this point and keep steadily climbing. Then try a bank turn left or right to bring the model back towards the takeoff area. You will find when turning you will need to use the rudder a lot more than the roll control. This is something bank and yank pilots will have to get used to. This method does not work with the Auto-G2V2 or any autogyro for that matter. If you have flown helicopters or large-scale models, you will be well used to this style of flying and coordinating your turns using roll, ailerons, and rudder. Be careful not to fly too far away, as orientation with this style of model is more difficult than with conventional fixed-wing airplanes. Once at a safe height, throttle back a little and get used to the delightful flying characteristics of your Auto-G2V2. Once you are settled and getting familiar with the handling, turn it into wind and slow it down by easing back on the elevator and using the power to control the height. You will find that it will almost hover by using quite a lot of up elevator and quite a bit of power. We do not recommend that you aerobat the Auto-G2V2, but it will do very nice stall turns. Just remember that once you have completed the stall turn at the top of the maneuver, you will need to throttle back, ease back more on the elevator as the nose drops to slow the model down. This will keep the rotors spinning nicely and not allow the model to overspeed. By now, you should be ready to attempt a landing approach. As normal, fly a nice left or right-hand circuit and set yourself up on the final approach to the landing area. Initially, just treat it the same as any fixed-wing airplane and fly it down the approach using elevator and throttle control to achieve a steady descent. Once near the ground, Just round out gently as normal, and with a bit of power still on, gently flare. You don't need too much elevator to achieve a nice 3-point landing. Once you have flown the Auto-G2V2 a few times, you will find you can really slow it up on landing using lots of elevator and quite a bit of power, and land with very little forward speed for super short landings. We hope you enjoyed your first flight with your Auto-G2V2 and have many more enjoyable flights in the future. My only crash with the Auto-G2V2 during the test flights was, based on my analysis, caused by three things. Probably too much roll angle. At the same moment, a gust of wind that hit the main rotor from below due to the excessive roll angle and reduced rotor RPM. Too little altitude for a full recovery, and insufficient power due to old LiPo batteries. However, since I was still able to level the gyrocopter before touchdown in a wheat field, there was no damage to the aircraft. In my experience, the Auto-G2V2 does not suffer from a stall of the main rotor. However, at very low speeds, there is a kind of stall at the rudder, which then cannot control anymore because it is not getting enough airflow. In that situation, the Auto-G2V2 tends to yaw slightly to the left. With headwind, it may not be much, but with tailwind, it can be up to a 45-degree turn. Recovery from this state is relatively simple and is done by adding more throttle. The flight direction is then dictated by the gyrocopter and can only be corrected again once sufficient airspeed has been regained. On a large flying field, with enough altitude, and if the pilot has good orientation, it is no problem to recover the Auto-G2V2 from flying too slowly. It is important that the pilot remains calm during recovery, and only starts steering again once the flight attitude and direction of the autogyro are fully understood again. Transport. Transporting the Durafly Auto-G2V2 gyrocopter from Hobbyking is not much different from transporting an RC airplane. The main rotor can be removed very quickly and easily. You just need to unscrew the rotor end cap, and then you can remove the main rotor. You can then screw the rotor cap back onto the main rotor shaft so you don't lose it. However, you have to be careful not to screw it in too far. Otherwise, the cap can come apart like it did for me and needs to be glued back together. Durability. The Durafly Auto-G2V2 gyrocopter from Hobbyking is a bit more durable than its predecessor, but still a relatively fragile RC aircraft. It survived a few tip-overs during crosswind landings, an off-field landing, and even a rollover. The rotor blades were slightly compressed and damaged, but still work perfectly. In my view, the Durafly Auto-G2V2 gyrocopter is for more experienced RC pilots, just as it is advertised by Hobbyking. It won't break from the first tip-over, but it is not designed for repeated tip-overs and rollovers, and certainly not for crashes. In my opinion, the Auto-G2V2 gyrocopter is better suited for good flying conditions with little wind and low turbulence, and a large landing area. Not a small asphalt road without runoff areas, and with a lot of crosswind like in this video. Full-scale gyrocopters are said to have very good crosswind landing characteristics. I did not notice that with this model. It was actually a bit more difficult than with an RC airplane. For your first flight with the Auto-G2V2 gyrocopter, I recommend very calm wind conditions and a large grass landing area. Pros and cons in short. In short, the Durafly Auto-G2V2 gyrocopter from Hobbyking is a great and unique aircraft that I would recommend to any experienced RC pilot and aviation enthusiast who wants to try something new and is willing to fly in a relaxed manner. In my view, it is an ideal relaxation device for experienced RC pilots who want an aircraft that forces them to fly calmly again, similar to RC paragliders. RC gyrocopters are, in my opinion, almost like RC paragliders, but better suited for stronger wind and with a better sound. The downsides of the Durafly Auto-G2V2 gyrocopter from Hobbyking are mainly the rather small battery compartment, the very limited space for the receiver, and the current spare parts situation, which is unlikely to change in the future. At the moment, no spare parts for the Durafly Auto-G2V2 gyrocopter from Hobbyking are available on the Hobbyking website.